At 11:42 a.m., 15 miles behind enemy lines, he made a decision that would erase every tactical advantage he had left. He stopped resisting, not because he had given up, but because resistance was exactly what they expected. And expectation was the only weapon they had that he could turn against them. What he didn't know yet was that this single choice would make him invisible, not to their eyes, but to their system. And in war, the system is what kills you. The year is 1951. The war is Korea, a conflict defined not by grand invasions, but by frozen mountains, collapsing supply lines, and the systematic erasure of soldiers who strayed too far from their units. He is 24 years old, a reconnaissance officer, not decorated, not senior, just one name on a roster that hasn't been updated in 3 weeks. His unit was overrun during a winter patrol. He was separated, captured within hours. No weapons, no map, no radio, just a name, a rank, and a rule drilled into him since basic training: resist, evade, escape. But resistance assumes the enemy doesn't already know what you'll do, and this enemy had captured hundreds before him. They knew the patterns, the psychology, the timeline. They knew that most men break within 72 hours, that some try to escape in the first week, that almost none succeed after the second. They didn't need to break him quickly, they just needed to follow procedure, and procedure had never failed them before. The camp was not large: 17 prisoners, 4 guards on rotation, a single perimeter fence that wasn't electrified because it didn't need to be. Escape wasn't prevented by walls, it was prevented by geography. 40 miles of winter terrain in every direction. No roads, no villages, no neutral ground. Even if a man made it past the fence, he would freeze before dawn, starve before he found shelter. And if the cold didn't kill him, the patrols would. The enemy didn't chase escapees with dogs or vehicles, they simply waited, because the land did the work for them. Inside the camp, the routine was deliberate: morning count, interrogation rotation, minimal rations, no conversation between prisoners unless supervised. The guards were efficient, not cruel, not careless. They followed a system refined over years of managing captured personnel. And that system had one foundational assumption: prisoners want to escape. Every security measure was built around that assumption: the fence, the count, the isolation, the interrogation schedule, all of it designed to detect intent before it became action. But there was a flaw, not in the fence, not in the patrols, in the assumption itself, because the system was designed to catch men who wanted to leave. It had no protocol for a man who appeared to stop wanting anything at all. During his first interrogation, he gave his name and rank. Nothing more. Standard resistance protocol. The interrogator expected this, noted it, moved on. During his second interrogation, he was asked about his unit's movements. He refused to answer. Also expected. But during his third interrogation, something changed. He didn't refuse. He hesitated. Not long, just enough to be noticed. The interrogator paused, adjusted his approach, asked a different question. He hesitated again, then answered, partially, inaccurately, but without defiance. The interrogator made a note: subject beginning to comply. It wasn't true, but it appeared true. An appearance was enough, because the system didn't measure reality, it measured behavior. And his behavior had just shifted into a category the enemy recognized: early stage cooperation. Over the next 6 days, he gave small answers, wrong answers, answers that seemed reluctant but not fabricated, answers that made him appear broken but not useless, answers that moved him from resistant prisoner to intelligence asset under development. And that reclassification changed everything. Resistant prisoners were watched constantly. Cooperative prisoners were watched differently, not less, just differently. Because cooperation implied compliance, and compliance implied predictability, and predictable prisoners didn't need to be restrained, they needed to be processed. By the 8th day, his interrogation schedule changed. Instead of twice daily, it became once every 2 days. Instead of isolation between sessions, he was allowed into the common area with other prisoners for short periods, not as a reward, as part of the protocol for managing assets who were no longer considered flight risks. The guards didn't make this decision consciously, they followed procedure. And procedure said, once a subject shows compliance trajectory, reduce pressure to avoid regression. He hadn't escaped, he hadn't fought. He had simply made the system believe he was no longer trying to. And that belief created the one thing no wall or patrol ever could: a blind spot, not in space, in perception. The enemy was no longer watching for escape, they were watching for relapse. And those are not the same thing. Every prisoner who had ever escaped did so within the first 2 weeks. They ran at night. They hid during counts. They attacked guards during transfer. All of them followed the same logic. Act before the system hardens around you. He did the opposite. He waited. Not because he had a plan, but because he understood something the others didn't. The system wasn't designed to contain prisoners long term. It was designed to process them. and processing required movement. Prisoners didn't stay in the camp forever. They were transferred, consolidated, moved to larger facilities deeper behind enemy lines. The camp was a collection point, a temporary hold. And temporary systems have gaps that permanent ones don't. By the 10th day, he had identified 3 patterns. First, transfers happened every 12 to 14 days. Second, prisoners marked as cooperative were transferred first. Third, during transfer, security protocols changed. Not relaxed, changed. Because the threat model was different. Inside the camp, the enemy controlled everything. The fence, the count, the routine. During transfer, they controlled nothing except the vehicle and the road. And roads could be ambushed. Vehicles could be intercepted. So the guards during transfer weren't watching the prisoners. They were watching the terrain. That was the crack. Not a failure of discipline, not a mistake. A structural gap created by conflicting priorities. The guards couldn't watch both. And he had been reclassified into the category that made him eligible for the next transfer. On the 12th day, his name appeared on the transfer list. He didn't react, didn't acknowledge it, just continued his pattern of reluctant compliance. One day before the scheduled transfer, he did something no one expected. He asked to speak to the interrogator, voluntarily. The guards were confused, suspicious, but protocol said, if a subject requests interrogation, allow it, document it. It indicates willingness to provide information. He was brought to the interrogation room. The interrogator sat down, notepad ready. He spoke quietly. He said he wanted to give information about his unit, not under pressure, but because he had been thinking, and he believed cooperation was the only rational choice. The interrogator nodded, wrote this down. Then he said something else. He said he didn't want to be transferred with the other prisoners. He said some of them were hostile to him now, that they knew he had been talking, that he feared retaliation during transport. The interrogator paused. This was plausible. Collaborative prisoners were often targeted by resistant ones. It was a known dynamic. The interrogator made a note. Subject requests isolated transfer for safety reasons. Then he asked, what information could he provide in exchange? He gave a name, a position, a fabricated detail about a supply route. Wrong, but specific enough to sound real. The interrogator accepted it and added a second note. I recommend isolated transfer, subject cooperative and vulnerable to internal threat. He was returned to his cell. He had just done something irrational. He had requested isolation. He had volunteered to be separated from the group. Every escape manual, every resistance protocol, every tactical doctrine said the same thing. Stay with other prisoners. Numbers create opportunity. He had asked for the opposite, and the enemy had granted it, because it aligned with their system. Isolated transfers were more secure, easier to manage, lower risk of group resistance. From their perspective, he had just made their job easier. From his perspective, he had just removed every variable he couldn't control. The transfer was scheduled for 6 a.m. He was woken at 5:30. No breakfast, no delay. Just 2 guards, handcuffs, and a canvas-covered transport truck. He was placed in the back, alone, no other prisoners, exactly as he had requested. The truck started moving at 6:14 a.m. The road was rough, unpaved, winding through low hills covered in frozen scrub. The guard sat in the cab. He sat in the bed, secured to a metal rail by a short chain. He could see through the gap in the canvas, mountains to the west, open terrain to the east. No villages, no structures, just cold, empty land. The truck moved slowly, not because of caution, because the road was unstable. Frozen mud, loose gravel, sections washed out by earlier rains. Every few minutes, the truck slowed to navigate a rough patch. The guards weren't talking. They were focused on the road ahead, watching for ambush points, disabled vehicles, anything irregular. They weren't watching him, not because they were careless, but because the chain made him a non-threat. And the terrain made escape suicidal. Even if he freed himself, he had nowhere to go. 40 miles of open ground, no cover, no food, no winter gear. He would be found within hours. That's what the system assumed, and the assumption was correct, under normal conditions. But he wasn't planning a normal escape. At 7:03 a.m., the truck hit a deep rut. The frame lurched. The guards cursed. The vehicle stopped. One guard got out to inspect the wheels. The other stayed in the cab, engine running, watching the road. He didn't move, didn't test the chain, didn't look for an opening. He just sat, watched, waited. The guard finished his inspection, climbed back in. The truck resumed. At 7:41 a.m., they passed a destroyed bridge. The detour added 15 minutes. The guards were annoyed, still cautious, still focused outward. At 8:12 a.m., the truck slowed again. This time, the road narrowed between 2 low ridges, a natural choke point, the kind of place an ambush would happen. Both guards were tense now, eyes scanning the ridgeline, hands near their weapons. The truck crawled forward. No ambush came. They relaxed slightly. And that's when he moved. Not violently, not suddenly. He shifted his weight, let his body slump against the side of the truck bed, as if he had lost consciousness. The chain rattled. One of the guards glanced back through the cab window, saw him slumped, saw the chain still attached, saw no immediate threat. Turned back to the road. He remained still, breathing shallow, posture limp. 3 minutes passed. The truck continued. Then at 8:19 a.m., he made a sound. Not loud, just a low groan, pained, weak. The guard glanced back again. This time he said something to the other guard. The truck slowed. Not stopped, just slowed. The second guard turned and looked through the window. He was still slumped, eyes half closed, face pale. The guards exchanged words. Then the truck stopped. One guard got out, walked to the back, pulled the canvas aside, looked at him. He didn't move. The guard stepped closer, checked the chain, still secure, checked his pulse, still present. Then he did what protocol required. He reported it. Prisoner unresponsive, possible medical event. The second guard joined him. They discussed options. Turn back, continue to the next checkpoint. Protocol said, medical emergencies during transfer must be reported immediately. But the nearest radio was at the checkpoint, 15 miles ahead. They decided to continue, but they moved him, not because they were compassionate, but because an unresponsive prisoner couldn't sit upright safely during rough transport. They unhooked the chain from the rail, laid him flat in the truck bed, resecured the chain to a lower anchor point. Then they returned to the cab. The truck resumed. He remained still. But now he wasn't sitting. He was lying down, closer to the tailgate, closer to the road. And the chain had more slack. Not much, but enough. At 8:47 a.m., the truck hit another deep rut. The impact was sharp. The tailgate latch, worn from years of rough roads, rattled loose. Not open, just loose. The guards didn't notice they were watching the road. At 9:03 a.m., the truck slowed for another washed-out section. The suspension groaned, the tailgate shifted. Still not open, but no longer secure. At 9:15 a.m., he opened his eyes. Not fully, just enough to see. The tailgate was 6 inches from his feet. The latch was barely holding. The truck was moving at walking speed. The guards were still focused ahead. He didn't move yet. He waited. At 9:22 a.m., the truck entered a section of road flanked by dense scrub, the kind of terrain that would require a slow, careful search if something went wrong. He shifted his weight. Not suddenly, just a slow roll toward the tailgate. The chain pulled tight, but the slack he'd gained earlier gave him just enough range. His boot touched the tailgate. He pressed. Gently, the latch gave. The gate swung open. Silently, he didn't jump, didn't scramble. He let gravity do the work. He slid backward, off the truck, onto the frozen road. The impact was hard, but he rolled with it, into the scrub, out of sight. The truck continued. The guards didn't notice, not immediately, because they weren't listening for a fall. They were listening for an engine, a weapon, a shout, not silence. It would be 4 minutes before they checked. By then he was already moving, not running, crawling, deeper into the scrub, away from the road. Not toward anything, just away. The guards discovered the open tailgate at 9:26 a.m. They stopped immediately, checked the truck bed, empty. The chain was still there, attached to nothing. He had slipped the cuffs, not broken them, slipped them. Because during the medical check, when they moved him, they had loosened the cuffs slightly to check his wrists for injury, standard procedure, and he had kept his wrists flexed during resecuring, creating just enough space. The guards radioed the checkpoint, reported the escape. Search teams were dispatched, but they were searching for a man on foot, running, desperate, covering ground. That's what escaped prisoners do. He wasn't running. He was hiding, 200 meters from the road, in a shallow depression beneath a stand of frozen brush, completely still. The search teams passed within 50 meters. They didn't find him, not because they weren't thorough, but because they were searching forward, toward where he should be, not backward, toward where he was. The enemy followed their training perfectly. They assumed escape meant distance, movement, flight. But he had never entered that pattern. He had stayed close, invisible, not because he was hidden well, but because he was in a place no one thought to look. By nightfall, the search had moved 5 miles east. He was still within sight of the road, and when the patrols thinned, he began moving. Not east, west, back toward the camp, toward the one direction no escaped prisoner would ever go, toward the single corridor the enemy had left unguarded, because no one guards the route that leads nowhere. He walked for 3 nights, avoided roads, avoided light. On the 4th day, he encountered a patrol from his own side. They almost shot him. He was emaciated, frostbitten, barely recognizable, but alive. He was debriefed, asked how he escaped. He told them. They didn't believe it at first, not because it was impossible, but because it violated every escape doctrine they had ever taught. But the timeline matched. The location matched. And he was standing in front of them, so they documented it, classified it, and revised their training. Because he had done something no manual had ever suggested. He hadn't fought the system. He had made the system fight itself. After the war, he never spoke about the escape publicly, not because it was heroic, but because survival isn't about courage. It's about recognizing that the enemy's strength is also their limitation. And sometimes the only way out is through the gap they can't see. This account is based on documented prisoner escapes and declassified interrogation protocols from the Korean War. Names and specific details have been altered, but the tactics and the logic behind them are real.